to extortion, illegal gambling, arson, loan sharking, and labor racketeering.
Faces of the accused because they are presumed to be innocent. This sweep, more than 100, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, involving 7 mob families, the 5 New York families, the Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, Bonanno, and Lucchese families, as well as the smaller New Jersey family, the Cavalcantes. They are believed to be the inspiration for The Sopranos, and in New England, as well as a slew of bookies, middle management, and other...
So here's the proof, huh? Give the story because it's better than the truth, huh? Allegories will keep between me and you, huh? We get coins, never scraps. See this a Bitcoin getting cat, so join get it back, huh? Give the story because it's better than the truth, huh? Allegories will keep between me and you, huh? We get coins, never scraps. See this a Bitcoin getting cat, so join get it back. Federal, grab the Colombo, see proof of work, I made it legible. Move out to cyber, was keeping crimes off of the web for you. Started a special group, yeah, I went private. Fell in love with Bitcoin and started mining. That's when I started shining. Getting green, dropping gems, rocking the comic club, got them sent. They laugh, popping limbs. Give them life, here's the boost. Gotta put in the work, here's the proof. So here's the proof, huh? Give the story because it's better than the truth, huh? Allegories will keep between me and you, huh? We get coins, never scraps. See this a Bitcoin getting cat, so join here's the proof, huh? Give the story because it's better than the truth, huh? Allegories will keep between me and you, huh? We get coins, never scraps. See this a Bitcoin getting cat, so join get it back.
Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. I'm back. Hey, everybody. It's been a while. It's been about almost a year, I think, since my last podcast. And it's been a horrendous year. 2020, the end of 2022, going into 2023 was a year I don't think anyone in my family will forget. We went away for Christmas vacation last year. I remember I did a show at McGuire's. It was, one of the last shows I was going to be able to do before the Christmas holiday. And it was a freezing week here in New York. It was around December. It was probably like 3-4 days before Christmas. And it was very, very cold. And it gets cold here in New York for those of you listening that might not be in New York. But we've had some pretty mild winters, especially the last 2 or 3 years. I bought a snowblower probably about 3 years ago. And because of that, it won't snow ever again here in New York because the thing just sits there, never used. But we get some, cold weather. We haven't gotten a lot of snow in the past, several years. But that week was particularly cold. It was below freezing, so it was probably single digits. And I remember I went to McGuire's out in Bohemia. We did a show. I did a show out there, and I think this was 2 days before Christmas. And I came back and when I got back home, my 2 kids that were there, because my wife and my daughter had already went upstate to start getting ready for the holidays. We go up there often, especially for the holidays. And it was just me and my middle child, who was 14 at the time. My son was 10. And I got back, and sometimes when you do a show, you're kind of amped up, and at least for me, and I sometimes you're kind of adrenaline still rushing if it's a fun show. And it was like 9:30 at night. So I said to the kids, like, why don't we just get in the car and head up there tonight? I'm a night owl more than I am a morning person. So, it made sense to, just do the driving at night. There would be no traffic. And the kids were wide awake anyway. They were supposed to be asleep, but of course they weren't. So we packed up the car. I lowered the heat down to 65. We jumped in the car and headed up to Albany. Now that night it was probably -15 with the wind chill. And without the wind chill, it was probably about 6 or 7 degrees. We had a great time in Albany. Then we went to Syracuse to visit some more relatives up there. Did a lot of snowboarding, having a great time. And on the day that we're returning home from the vacation, that morning, my wife and oldest daughter, who had a separate car throughout the vacation, left that morning before I left with the other 2. So they were once again kind of in the car before the rest of us. And I get this frantic phone call from my wife and daughter saying, there's a mouse in the house. it's on one of the cameras. Now I have cameras all throughout my house, and I'd like to keep an eye on everything if I'm not there, even when I'm home, like, you know, in the monitors you see behind me, when they're in normal operation, I can see everything going on, inside and outside the house, so that if, I'm in the basement and someone's at my door running around my property, I won't discover that when they're, coming through my office door with a shotgun. So when I go on vacation, I keep an eye on the house, right? And I have sensors and stuff all over the house. And so the mouse thing was interesting to me because prior to leaving, probably about 2 months before leaving, I had been on a mission to capture not a mouse, but a giant rat that was somehow gain access into a portion of my house, into the ceiling. And so, to rewind for a second on that, I was in the basement probably 3 months before that phone call, and I was watching TV, and I heard the dog run across the ceiling upstairs, and it sounded louder than usual. And I kind of made a note of it. I was like, oh, it's weird, dogs running across. And like a week later, I heard the dog run across the ceiling again when I was in the basement, except the dog wasn't home. Nobody was home. So I started scratching my head, wondering what could have made that sound. And so I started putting cameras in the crawl spaces. So like right to this side of me over here, in the basement, there's, where the ductwork runs. There's these little kind of like eaves, these little, eaves where there's access panels, and you can see, you could pop your head up there, and you could, put a flashlight up there and look around. And so I started throwing cameras in these areas that I heard the noise based on motion, triggered on motion. And sure enough, like after a day of having a camera in there, I see this giant rat. In fact, I have a video of it that I could try to insert into this. I'll try to drop it in to this video so you can see it.
For those of you watching this on YouTube, here's the video of the rat running in my ceiling in my basement.
But what you're going to see on the video is the rat plops out of like the side of like this no man's land space and drops into this eave, and he's fucking long, and he kind of looks at the camera and then runs the other way. So I knew this wasn't a mouse just based on what I could see, but I knew if I told my family, especially my daughters and my wife, that there was a rat in the house, they would move out. That's where we're at in my house in terms of standard of living. They're not going to work with me on that. If there is a rodent in the house, they would be in a hotel until I captured it, and I wouldn't be permitted to do anything until I could show them proof positive that the rat was captured. So this is one of those times as a father, and I think this comes up in a lot of husbands that I talk to have had this situation where there's just things that you learn that you just have to keep from your family. You have to absorb the horrors of some of these things, because sharing them with your family will not result in any sort of support or understanding or making it easier to solve the problem. They will just compound the problem by throwing in their demands of now what needs to be done. And so this is one of those situations where I said, I will capture this rat, and I will murder it, and I will bury it in the yard, and I will never speak of it. So I started to do that. This was several months before Christmas, and I was putting traps up there. This fucking rat would run up to the traps. It would look at the peanut butter or the bait that I put in there, the little drops that I put in there, and it would just look at the camera and then just walk away. So I started Googling, like, can rats see infrared? According to the internet, no. But this rat, there's no way this rat could not see infrared. He would look at that camera and see that light, and after a while, he wouldn't even go near the traps. Like, he would just look down in the corridor where the camera was, where the the bait was, and he just wouldn't even bother. So it got really frustrating to try to catch this thing. And then maybe a month into this process of trying to capture this rat, my daughter, I hear my daughter screaming. I'm in the upstairs and I hear her screaming, and I come downstairs and I'm like, what, what's going on? And she said, Dad, under the kitchen cabinet in the kitchen, like under the sink, I heard like banging sounds, and she recorded it on her phone, and it sounded like somebody was in there trying to escape. It sounded like somebody was banging wood, and of course, I thought, there's no way this could be the rat, but what else could it be? But there's no way it could be that loud. So I hope she put like a bungee around the thing. That's how bad it was. She's like, something's in there. So I put a bungee around the cabinet handles, or she put it on. So I take the bungee off and I open it, and I look at where there's like the drain pipe will go into the wall. And there's of course a little bit of a space around the hole they cut. So if it was a 2-inch pipe, it was maybe a 3-inch hole. And I see gnaw marks, like teeth gnaw marks on the hole. And when I look directly below the hole, I see like sawdust filings, like when something's chewing something and the sawdust is falling around. And my daughter's like standing behind me, and I have to come up with some bullshit explanation for this, like ASAP, because she's like, what could it be? And I cannot tell her there's a murderous rat that's trying to now get into the actual house. It's one thing when it's in a little eave or something and maybe it's going in and out. That's bad enough, but we never saw droppings in the house. Now it's trying to find its way into the fucking house. So I tell her that it was the dishwasher drain line, because the dishwasher at the time was right next to the sink, and it's got a pump that's within the dishwasher, and it's feasible that if the pump is maybe pulsating, that the water line could, flex back and forth, which I thought was pretty good, considering it was on the fly. And she's like, well, it sounded like that. And I was like, no, you're crazy. So things were ramping up at this point. I filled that in with foam around the pipe, and I put more traps. I put more cameras. So when we left for Christmas vacation, I felt like that was my time to capture it because nobody would be home. And I thought that would embolden the rat to be more aggressive and maybe even get hungry because it was getting very cold out. And, so when they had called me now, right, fast forwarding, now they're driving back from our vacation, and I get the phone call that says there's a mouse in the crawl space. I know immediately what they're talking about, as my wife finally looked at her Blink camera apps. We were using a lot of Blink cameras at the time. And she must have just saw the motion alert, and that was kind of when she became aware of it. So I tell them on the phone, oh, geez, there's a mouse. Okay, let me check this out. Knowing almost for sure what it was, I log on to the Blink app, and I look at the video of the mouse. And the problem is I don't see the video they were referring to immediately, because I go to the live view, because my concern was, did we catch it? So I immediately go to the live view to see if it's in one of the traps. And not only do I not see the rat in any of the traps, but I see the unmistakable mist, the unmistakable artifacts you'd see on a video camera placed in a high humidity environment. If you've ever taken video when it's been really humid out, you can actually see, the lens will pick up like the moisture in the air. And I see like this, almost like that fog that it presents. And I'm kind of, again, my brain's not putting it together what it is. And I'm like, why does it look so dark in there? Everything looked like 3 shades darker. And there was this like mist. So then I turn the sound on, and I hear like the unmistakable sound, like I hear water. And I was just completely, like, why is there water? How would water get in the crawl space? Like there's a hose on the outside of the house. I'm like, did that like burst? But I blow my lines out. So I'm like, and I had been checking on the house the whole week. I had been logging into the cameras, and I've been looking around the house, and, mostly you're looking for like if there was signs of intrusion or something, some guy hanging out on your couch. It really wasn't logging in to look for anything, that wasn't completely obvious. And so I turned the sound on in the like the kitchen area, and I just hear rain. I hear, just the sound of water, rain, like in my house. So then I start looking really close at like the things, and I'm like, is that, water, in the ceiling? Because like it looks a little dark or something. And then I start jumping around the cameras in the house, turning the sound on, and you can hear just water coming through in every room that I have a camera in. It's just like that sound of water, just like drop, water drops. So, I freak out because I'm all the way in Syracuse, and my wife's probably got an hour or hour and a half head start on me. At this point, I don't even care about the rat because, there's a situation. So I call a friend. At the time, I didn't have any sort of way to shut the water off. So I call a friend and I said, "Can you get to my house? I think I have a disaster brewing." And a friend of mine who I've actually had on this podcast, Craig, a good friend of ours, him and his wife and his kid, and he lives pretty close. So he jumps in the car, comes to my house, and he I give him the code to the door. He comes in, and I'm in the car now, trying to drive back from Syracuse, or about to leave. I was still packing, I think, at that time. And he opens the door and he's like, "Oh, geez, there's water here, and there's water on the floor, and oh no, He's like, "I'm not gonna lie to you, it's pretty fucking bad in here." And you're sitting there completely helpless because you're trying to get a description, and you're like, "How bad? Is it coming through the ceiling?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's in your living room. It's coming through the ceiling." And then he'd say like, "Well, your dining. Oh no, yeah, it's in your dining room too." And then now I'm like, my computer equipment. Your mind starts going to like all the things that are either expensive or irreplaceable. So he like goes upstairs. He goes into the crawl space and shuts the water off. But there's so much water flowing through the house. It's not like you turn it off and it's going to stop immediately. You're talking about tens of minutes before I think, you could expect the water to stop moving through. So he shuts the water off, and I'm like, all right, at least that's done. And now he's going to investigate, and he starts going through the house, looking at the water in each room. And it's going from, he starts at the basement, and he's like, "Yeah, your podcast stuff's all wet. Your computer's wet. Your monitors are wet." And and he's sending me pictures, and now I have another friend that shows up in the house, and he's helping out too. And they're sending me pictures and calling, and it's really actually, I think I have some photos here, so this layout should work. So you can see here, these are some of the pictures. I think I was back home at this point. This is probably a picture that I took, not one that was sent to me, but this is essentially what it looked like. You can see here in the photo, this is my living room. So at this point, they had already removed we had 2 rugs in there, 2 couches in there, and like a carpet on top of the wood floor, and like an area, and then rugs on top of that. Whatever, those were drenched because you can see from the ceiling that the water was coming through very heavily in this room, and the carpets were drenched. The wood floor is already warped in this photo. Like you can see, it's very dark. And this is before they started the actual like demo. This is just them removing like furniture at this point. This same room, here's another shot of the next stage, which was removing all the sheetrock. There's still some sheetrock actually left on the right, and this was all taken down to the studs eventually. So the wood floor is still in this shot. That was all ripped out. This was all taken down to the studs. Here's a photo of where at one point you could stand in pretty much anywhere in the house and kind of look all the way up. So you can look all the way up into the upstairs floor. That's my son on the second floor. And there's actually an angle you can't see here where I could have looked into the attic at one point. The basement kind of looked like this before everything was ripped out and removed. So we had a party right before we had left town. So that's where like the karaoke is, and the pool table was actually on the other side. That was moved in this picture. There was, I forget what was over there at that time. Oh no, wait, the pool table was there on that side at that time. But you can see the water on the floor, water coming through the ceiling. Again, everything's just soggy, wet. that stuff had dripped, the water had dripped down on so many things. It's funny. I had the hot tub in the basement. A lot of people said, was it the hot tub? And ironically, I drain the hot tub when I'm not using it. So it's only really has water in it when it's being used. And then I immediately would drain it. And ironically, the hot tub was kind of the unsung hero because it had caught, because it was empty, it had captured several inches of water that were coming through the ceiling. Not enough to make a difference in the end, but had it been, a limited leak, maybe it would have done something to prevent it from hitting the floor, but it actually captured a lot of the water, which was kind of funny. So here's what the basement, ultimately. So then they started this is the basement now from another angle. So they started ripping down, everything, the ceiling, and the funny thing about water is you don't really know right away how far the damage went because it's so insidious as it moves through your house. It doesn't necessarily present itself visually, maybe for a day or two or three. And so as we followed the water through the house day after day, it started to go, well, we could probably save this room. It was like trying to save, limbs from gangrene, and it just kept spreading. And so eventually it was just like, yeah, this is a total loss. So all this stuff started getting ripped up. The floor got ripped up. The ceiling got ripped up. The walls ripped up here. Even those posts at some point got ripped up. It got reduced to just concrete. I don't know if I have a photo of that. Yeah, here's where you could just see the concrete. We have the dehumidifiers running. So this is right after Christmas. This is right before New Year's, after Christmas, before New Year's. I think we got home like, a day before New Year, like New Year's Eve, or maybe it was even New Year's Eve. And then, again, the rest of the house, like, just let's see, this was the upstairs. When you walked into the house, kind of now you could see more stuff has been removed here in these photos. And, it just kept getting worse and worse. It just kept getting reduced, to more and more. This was the kitchen area. This is actually after the ceiling was replaced in here, but the floor all the tile on the floor got removed. The kitchen cabinets, everything got removed. This was probably one of the photos that was sent to me from one of my friends, because you can see there's still some furniture in the room, and you can just see the water coming down. And then I ended up, so we get back, and this is a shot of the RV. So, the way my layout of my property is, I can keep my RV kind of like on the side. Like if you came down my driveway, it's kind of in the woods. It's accessible, but it's not very close to the house, but it's accessible. And, I use it as an office and stuff like that throughout the year. But so we immediately moved into the RV. Most of us, my son and I, were prepared. I think we're more preppers. So we were preparing for some sort of catastrophe. So my son didn't even skip a beat. He's like, gets out of the car. He sees the house is trash. He's like, all right, where's my Switch? His Nintendo Switch. It's in your backpack. And just went in the RV and set up shop. Like, he's like, yep. Like he'd been preparing for this moment. I was ready to move into the RV. My daughters and my wife were like the ghosts of the fucking Titanic who didn't realize the ship had sunk, and they're still trying to live. They were still trying to live in the house for a period of time. My wife set up shop in the dining room and threw a mattress on the floor like a flop house. And, her and my daughter, I would go in there, and there's electrical wires hanging from the ceiling, holes in the floor. Heat's not staying in the house because all the insulation and everything's out. And, they're like acting like they're having like a sleepover with some sort of traumatic response, a response to a traumatic event, that they went into some sort of fantasy land. And I was like, you do realize this house is uninhabitable. So it took them a while to realize, how sort of bad it was and how unlivable everything was. So, all right, there we go. Get rid of that. So now we're back, and the question is, how did this happen? Like, what the hell happened? I knew from my friends being at the house, kind of checking things out, that the water looked like, once we got into my daughter's room upstairs, the water looked like there was an area in the closet where it looked like there was ground zero for where this all started. So directly above that is a heat exchange, which is essentially just a radiator, right? The way the system works, at least in my house, and for any forced air system, is pretty similar, which is we have natural gas. The natural gas goes to a boiler, which is in my basement down here. And then when there's a call for heat, like your thermostat hits a certain temperature, triggers the boiler to start generating hot water. That hot water runs through PEX piping, which is plastic, and the piping up in the attic is designed to be frozen and not burst, unlike a copper pipe, right? They, people installed it knew what they were doing in that sense, that the piping was designed to be frozen. And but then as the PEX goes up into the attic, it goes into a heat exchange, which is now like a radiator with the piping inside of it is copper. And the idea is the super, super hot water flows through this radiator, this exchange, and the air blows a fan through it. And now you're getting hot air blowing through your ductwork into your house. It's pretty, basic. These types of systems have existed for a very, very long time. And so tracing back now what happened, because it was clear that the exchange froze. So the PEX pipe probably froze solid, but was fine. But the water was dripping out of the exchange, which is copper piping in there, which, as you know, cannot expand. It's not a metal that's synonymous with expansion that occurs from, freezing. So the question was, how did this freeze? And then all the pieces kind of started coming together that, well, for this to freeze, that means there was no hot water running through. So we go down to the boiler and we look at the boiler, and there's, I think it was like a low flow error or something related to no flow or no flow or low flow. And so what we think happened was there was a malfunction on a sensor within the boiler that thought there was no water coming to it. And then that shut the boiler down, which meant even though my heat was set to 65, it wasn't being called, or when it was called, there was no response from the boiler. And as I mentioned, if you go back to the beginning of this story, I left that night when it was -15 with a wind chill and probably 6 or 7 degrees outside. My attic is not an insulated attic. It's an attic that's going to, it's going to be warmer than outside because it's capturing heat from the, rising, coming through little crevices or whatever, or even the ductwork that's in there is going to heat the room a little bit. So it's probably going to be 10 degrees warmer in there than it would be outside, but it's certainly not going to be 30 or 40 degrees warmer. So if it's like 0 degrees outside, my guess is my attic was probably at or near freezing. Now, normally, right, I've lived in this house for like 5 years, never had this problem. People say, well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because when you're in the house and your system's calling heat regularly, it's going to flush out any beginning stages of freezing. If the water's starting to crystallize, but then hot water is running through it, it's just going to flush that out with really hot, like boiling water, and it's never going to get a chance to freeze. So when you're at night, even if it's 0 degrees up there, your heat's going on, it's going off, it's going on, it's going off. But if the boiler is not sending the hot water there, and it could be calling it constantly, it's just not going to get the hot water up there. So now it probably lasted a day or so until it just froze solid. And then when that week, things started to get a lot warmer. They started getting into the 40s later that week, like a week later when I was in Syracuse, I was looking at the weather in Long Island. And when it started to thaw out is when I think the water started moving through the house, because when it's frozen, it's not really doing any damage. It's when it starts to thaw, and now the system is water can move through the pipes. So it's just basically like an open faucet up there that's just running water through my house for the entire, whatever week it was. So that's our best understanding of, how this all went down. It's preventable now that I know. I'm super paranoid now, and, I have all sorts of heating apparatuses up there in the attic and sensors. I even have a, camera up there that I watch it. Like, I have a Velociraptor stuck in my attic. I have a camera where it just watches the system, the exchanger, to see, God forbid, I could see any leaks. Like, I'm completely paranoid. Anything, an ice cube melts on my floor in my house, and I'm completely, freaking out, looking around, wondering if there's another surreptitious leak in my house. So we get home, they start ripping the house down. A couple of, you immediately go, Jesus, I hope I've been paying my homeowner's policy. I have it on auto pay, but at that moment you're like, if God forbid something went wrong. So you start getting on your computer and looking up your policies, and then you're starting to look at your coverage. And here's a tidbit, a couple of things to consider. Because if you're like me, you don't really think too much about your policy. It's like, whatever, you know, this is what my house structure is worth. This is what my property is worth. Get me a policy. There's a lot of endorsements in there that are important. The major one I would say is alternate. I think it's called an ALA, alternate living arrangement, or alternate living allocation. Essentially, what that is if something bad happens to your house and you can't live there, your insurance policy may or may not cover a hotel, a condo, a rental house, whatever. So that's a big deal if you're in the situation that we found ourselves in when you cannot live in your house and you need to move. And if you have to pay for, and you have a family of 5, so I'd be fine at the Holiday Inn Express, but my family would not be. So we did have an endorsement for that, thankfully. And we ended up for about a month. We were living in the RV for like a month. And then we said, well, how long is this rebuild going to take? And we started to realize it was going to take a hell of a lot longer than, you start hearing things like, oh, a month or 2. And I'm just using common sense looking at my house. I go, how could this be done in a month? Like, how? I need to do all sorts of electrical, plumbing work needs to be done. The house is down to the studs. You're talking about replacing everything. What size crew are you going to have, and how accessible are they going to be? So we realized this is going to take at least 6 months. So we end up leaning on that endorsement, and our insurance carrier was ultimately really great to work with. We had Narragansett Bay, which I think is through Geico, but our policy was underwritten through Narragansett Bay. And so we moved to another part of Long Island, which is a really beautiful part of Long Island called Asharoken. I don't know why I say it, Asharoken, which is on the north shore of Long Island. And it was like a really cool experience because we moved in there in February where it was freezing, but it's right on the water. But it was really nice because as things got warmer out, we were able to enjoy that. And our neighbors, who are also our landlord, we became good friends with, and they were really cool people. And they understood the situation. I didn't spend nearly as much time there because I was, living in the RV, really with my son, mostly keeping an eye on the house and managing the project. Because anyone who's gone through a large project knows you just can't say, oh yeah, I'll see you in 6 months. And you're going to come back. You're going to find a fucking toilet in your kitchen. You're going to find wires hanging in places they shouldn't be. Outlets are going to be upside down on the wall. You just have to be, unfortunately, you just have to be, just be on top of these types of projects personally. So they rip the house apart. We start moving, and I'm in the house one day, or I get called into the house, and one of the workers says, come to the basement. And in broken English, he keeps telling me there's something in the basement to see. I go in the basement and look, and this is when it was all down to the concrete, and they were ripping down the last pieces of the ceiling. And he points to the floor to a giant fucking rat. The rat, the king rat, the one that I saw on the camera, who fell out of the ceiling and was like soaking wet. So I could only imagine he got wet and froze to death, or he just drowned. Like he maybe got cornered in a part of the house where there was water and maybe just drowned. And I have a photo of it somewhere. I'll try to splice it into this thing, but it was a weird full circle moment, another kind of Matrix moment of like, did I create this? Like, did my obsession with killing this rat, like my goal was to kill the rat before I returned for the holidays. But it was like one of those weird Twilight Zone episodes where you asked for $1 million and then, the IRS taxes 99% of it. So it ruins your wish. I'm like, my goal of wishing this rat dead, I sometimes think like, yeah, I got my wish, but it cost me my fucking house. I sometimes think like it's just a weird thought to be like, why did he tell me? He showed me the rat. It was definitely the same rat. There was never on the video any more than one rat. It was always just this one king fucking rat. So it was just very strange. So I took pictures of it. I kind of, bagged it up. I threw in the yard or some shit. I didn't even try to explain to the guy the story behind the rat because it was just such a weird thing. And then they finished ripping out the ceiling. And one day I went down to the basement as the house is kind of being built. And when you're in, it was, the basement's dark, of course, but when the sun was out, you could look around the basement and see any holes because it's just sunlight. And sure enough, right in that corner, right near where that camera was, he was actually coming in like behind the camera. And there was a little tunnel area, like a little area that he could run along, and then he would plop out in the video. If I splice the video in to this to the show, where he drops down is where like that little tunnel, that little road access way ends, and then he's forced to jump into the eave, and that's where the couches used to be below. That's why I used to hear his fat ass running across the ceiling, because that was kind of like his 495 expressway route through there. So anyway, so they ripped that house down, and then, it takes several months to figure out like who you're going to use to rebuild the house. And like, then it opens up Pandora's box of, well, now that the house is gutted, for example, like, all right, there's plumbing that it's old copper plumbing. It would really be stupid for me to not just update it, because it's open. It's going to eventually cause a problem. And you become so paranoid and so traumatized from having to deal with this. You just go, all right, anything I can do to make sure this house is as bomb-proof as it is. So you start, like this basement I'm in, I used the Loctite, whatever it's called, stuff, and had them put, 2 or 3 coats of this stuff onto the concrete to keep moisture out. God forbid water ever tries to come in from, the floor. Piping was all, ripped out and replaced with PEX. You end up redoing rooms that weren't destroyed, were fixable, but you're like, what's the point? Like, what's the point? Just rip everything out. Put the bathroom in you want. Put the, the kitchen was like, all right, we got, replaced the kitchen, but how do we want to modify the floor plan? So, it took up until we just moved back in, maybe, I don't know, a couple months ago. And we just, we still had workers coming to the house up until like 2 weeks ago. I mean, there's still a few little things left that they have to finish, but, we had workers, it's even when we moved back in, like, you have workers coming, to the point where like the dog doesn't even bark at them. Like, they know who they are. They're just, and you give up all sort of, sense of control, because there's just no way. You just, like, if you're doing something and someone knocks on the door and the plumber's supposed to show up on a Monday, but he doesn't show up and he shows up on a Wednesday, what are you going to send them away? So you lose all control. It's just like, yep, do what you got to do. Like, house is open, you have the code. So, even when we were living in the other house and I had put cameras in this house so I could watch, there's random times people coming in and out of your house doing shit. And you're like, yeah, that's just the way it's going to be. Everything went into pods out in the driveway. I mean, it's just a total disaster. Losing track of your stuff. I'm pretty organized, and that's how I think a family can function properly. Is you have to have organization. You have to know where things are. You have to be able to get to them. And when the house gets destroyed, you lose all. You'll lose track of where things are, because you don't have a home base anymore, or it's in a pod. So, a month into this, the kids need a laptop now that is buried in the back of a pod. So you're spending the weekend pulling everything out of a pod to find a fucking laptop, or you just end up buying the same shit because you're like, I'm not going back in that pod. So we ended up buying so much stuff that the kids really needed, because I'm like, it's not worth my time. And I almost died in there. Like, I was emptying the pod one day and a whole wall of shit fell on me and nobody was with me. I'm like, I'm going to fucking die in this pod in my driveway, finding my daughter's cheerleading or dance outfit, because she has a competition, and we had the outfit long before the competition, and it's irreplaceable. And I'm in there at like 4-degree weather, like that guy who got the boulder trapped on his arm. I'm stuck under like half of a fucking pool table and an armoire, and I'm crushed in this thing, going, someone eventually should realize Dad is MIA and should hopefully come check on me, because I can't reach my phone. So in the end, we're back in. As you guys can see, I'm actually sitting in basically the same location where I've always done my podcast, but it looks very different because now I put an office down in the basement. I have the door now, and I I was a nut with running my HDMI cables and my Cat 6 cables and power to the places that I wanted. I mean, that was the benefit, is I've been living here for 5 years. So when you live at a house for 5 years, you know where you want your shit. You know where, oh man, I wish there was an outlet right there. I wish there was an Ethernet access panel right there. So at night, I would just, every night after I got done with work stuff, I would come to the house and just drill holes and run my cables through the house to everywhere I needed it to be. Which felt like at some point it was just becoming an obsession. But you just, when the house is wide open like that, and you're like, man, I can run an Ethernet cable or an HDMI cable from the basement to the bedroom upstairs fairly easily. It still took an hour, but trying to do that when your house is back together, it's impossible. There's so much damage that would be done. Nobody would ever do it. So I ended up doing that. And that stuff paid huge dividends when we moved back in. And as the house was getting rebuilt, because now we have things where they're supposed to be, things where we want them. I don't have a picture, or maybe I'll splice it in, but I end up redoing my karaoke setup, which for anyone who knows me knows that if you have parties and have people over, that's something that's just a ton of fun. And, it's a great way to entertain. And we put a bar down in the basement, and we have I have like a proper karaoke stage, and, all the wires for the karaoke setup are now through the wall or under the stage. The karaoke equipment itself the back end is in a closet, and there's like a cubby where you can access it. So it's kind of like a dream to be able to design that stuff the way you want. Not the way I would want to go about doing it, but that was really cool. So, and everything else is good. We're back in, and that part, almost to a year now. We're coming up on a year on December, December 20 something would be a year when this all started. So my equipment got wrecked. I started to rebuild the equipment and repurchase it and re-put the stuff together. But bottom line was, there was just no time to do any of these shows, because it was just trying to keep your family from murdering each other and dealing with the stresses of the contractors and the delays that go along with that, and, insurance and things like that. Another thing I would recommend is a public adjuster. If you ever end up in this situation, a public adjuster is somebody who, when you have these large losses, it's very difficult. If the insurance company says, here's $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, you don't know. Is that like enough? I don't know. I don't know if that sounds like it might be enough, but is it enough? So you have someone who's in this field, a public adjuster, who can then look at the estimate and say, this is too much or too little. This is where they're miscalculating or undervaluing. And they go argue, basically an advocate for you. And we hired a phenomenal public adjuster who reach out to me, and I'll give you the information. Same thing for my contractor, and I'll give you the pros and cons and sort of the overall, what to kind of expect, and through, ways to make it even a smoother process than what I had. But I was very happy in the end, because the insurance was good and the public adjuster did a great job. And ultimately in the end, the contractors made everything right in terms of getting us to, where we needed to be, even though we were like really behind on schedule and all that stuff. They stuck with us, which was really important, in the end, because in the end, if it takes a little bit extra time, at the time, it's very stressful and it's very frustrating, but a year or two down the road, you're like, whatever. Bottom line is, if it gets done and it gets done right, you can deal with that kind of stuff. And so then I rebuilt my office, rebuilt the equipment. This isn't even the correct camera I'm using, because the camera I have is not functioning properly, but I didn't want to keep delaying doing these podcasts because I enjoy doing them, and a few people have reached out and asked why. So that's the story behind what happened. I should probably warn anyone at the beginning of the show that if they want to just skip all this nonsense and they don't give a shit, they can jump to the next part. But there's other things I want to get into, other topics that I've been really dying to talk about. And so I'm going to start rolling into those next. All right, what I'm going to do is break this into multiple parts. So I'm going to put out another episode, get into some of the other topics. I think next episode I'm going to do is on Bitcoin and the upcoming Bitcoin spot ETFs, and why that's so important, and why people should be aware of it, and why I'm freaking out that a lot of people are not aware of it, and how awful that's going to be for them down the road if they don't start to understand this stuff. So thanks for joining me on this first podcast back since my house got wrecked. I hope everyone's doing all right, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.